Okay, we are live. Hi, this is William Ramsey. Welcome to William Ramsey Investigates. On today's show, a very special guest comes to us from the great state of South Carolina. His name is Mike Bedenbaugh. Last name is spelled Bedenbaugh. And if you're watching this on Rockfin, Rumble, or X Twitter, you'll see the title of his new book. Full title is Reviving Our Republic, 95 Theses for the Future of America, a Citizen's Call for Restoring Our Nation's Principles. Very timely book. There's a lot going on politically right now. I guess there always is, but you kind of wonder whether these original principles that were involved in the founding of this country really are relevant and they're meaningful. But Mike can talk more about that. So Mike Bedenbaugh, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, William, for having me. I really appreciate it.
Excellent. So for people who haven't heard your name, haven't heard of this book, maybe you can talk a little bit about your background and what led up to the publication of Reviving Our Republic.
Yeah, well, thank you. So I am from country South Carolina. I grew up in the country here. My father was a farmer. My mother was a teacher. My family has been here since the original founding of the state. My German ancestors, which is where the Bedenbaugh comes from, settled here in 1750. And I live within, right now where I live is my grandfather's home, and I live within 3 miles of where my Revolutionary War ancestors' cabin was. So we have always been here. My grandfather sold mules on the square in the little town of Prosperity where we live. But my life has taken a very journey through. I feel like I'm the feather in the Forrest Gump movie because I grew up here and I will say a very privileged life in a upper middle class farming family that was leaders in the community. But I also realized I wanted something else in my life than just right here in South Carolina. So I ended up leaving and joining the Navy and serving on board. Now, as much as I wanted to leave and explore, I joined the Navy when it was, the advertisements were, it's not a job, it's an adventure.
Right.
So I'm like, yes, I was 19 years old and I wanted an adventure. So I ended up getting out and going to San Diego for boot camp. And the first book they handed me was the Blue Jackets Manual. I opened it up and there was the USS South Carolina. And
Wow.
as much as I wanted to get away, I'm like immediately jumped and picked that ship, and I was able to get on that ship. So I served 5 years on the South Carolina, and it helped make me the person that I am. It was wonderful time service. I served under Reagan and had various adventures, but then I got out, and after being on the ship for those years and seeing all the Soviet ships following us around with all their bristling antenna. Well, you didn't know there were Soviet ships. There were little fishing boats with tons of antenna, and there were Soviet spy ships. And I was just fascinated with Russia. And so when I got out of the Navy, I went full time in studying Russian. I learned Russian language and Soviet studies. I saw myself as a talking head on Sunday morning shows talking about Russia is what I saw myself as doing. Ended up not doing that, and ended up running a company with my first wife doing promotional merchandise. I lived in LA for a while, New York. We worked for the big film industries out there. And then, but all this time, I've always loved history. I've always loved politics, not for the sake of politics, but for the sake of understanding the responsibility of being a citizen in a country that is supposed to be run by us. And that means that there's a responsibility to that. And I've always felt that way. When I lived in New York for a while, then came back home in 1991. And one of the first things I did was get on the Plan Commission and become on the town council. So I enjoy the aspect of civic duty, and I've always loved history. And so that led me through all of this journey. I've seen in the past 30 years a kind of a vulgarization of what's happened to our political discourse. And studying that and looking at that, how vulgar our political discourse has become, I realized through my studies in political science and everything that it's really a structural defect on, when you go bowling, there's a bowling lane and you have rules and how there's certain safeguards on how you bowl to get the pin for the ball from here to the pins.
Right.
Well, it's the same thing in political discourse. And the brilliance of our founding fathers in coming up with a structure, and really one of the that came out of the Enlightenment, a product of the Enlightenment, one of the first times where learned men got together and said, let's start a country and create this thing. And I think it's one of the most brilliant documents and efforts that ever happened in humankind. And so, yeah. And so my also love of the document was also realizing that George Washington is probably one of the most important men that was ever born in modern Western civilization. Because and a lot of this has to do with how the circumstances of being over here, a whole ocean away from Europe, where all was a mess over there. And these people were able to build their own capacity, their own sense of independence from being an ocean away, had the wealth to be able to have the time and leisure time to really study and think about who they were, build character among themselves. And they sat there and were able to sit down and create something that had never happened before. And the reason I love Washington, the reason I think Washington is absolutely the most important, is because not only was he willing to totally give up his life, he was one of the wealthiest men in the country, to give up his life for what he believed in, but he also set the tone. He set the tone for how the presidency should work. He set the tone for what real civic engagement is supposed to be. And the thing that he did, when people used to say the father of our country, and the fact that hardly anybody teaches that anymore, and here's why. Most revolutions are started by revolutionaries who are more focused on tearing something down, right? Because they hate the government, they hate what's going on, they just want to destroy it. They just want to get rid of it.
They hate the king, they hate the aristocracy.
Whatever it is. Revolutions, it happened in Russia. And so what tends to happen, these people that want to tear things down tend not to know how to build. They just know what they're angry at, but they don't know what they're wanting to do differently. And so Washington stood there after the war, after it was won, and General Gates gathered up all the lieutenants because they hadn't been paid up in Newburgh, New York. And they had a secret meeting. And Washington got word of this meeting because they were basically going to march on to Philadelphia and overthrow the elected government and put Washington in charge. Though I suspect Gates is the one that wanted to be in charge. He was just that kind of opportunistic guy. But Washington came in and stopped it with one speech. Everybody so respected him, stopped it. And because of the complexities of our country, we were going to have an inevitable civil war between the factions. But his leadership at the time when we needed the most was able to forestall that civil war 7 years and give time for the Constitution and traditions of governance to take such firm root that we were able to survive that conflagration to some degree. There's been
what was the name of that revolt? It was some kind of revolt, wasn't it?
Newburgh Conspiracy.
Newburgh Conspiracy. Okay, thanks.
Newburgh Conspiracy. And that right there did something that almost no revolution had ever succeeded in doing. Almost every other revolution that happened in the world, the truth of the revolution ended up themselves and having a civil war immediately. Happened in Russia, everywhere. So that was a very unique thing. And that's why I think his words and his precedence is so important, So while I was watching what's been going on in our public sphere and how people talk with each other, the book is inspired by two instances, not only Washington's life, but also Martin Luther's nailing the 95 Theses on the door in Wittenberg to push back a corrupted Catholic Church in the 16th century. And so I took that symbolism of those 95 Theses, and I then took Washington's farewell address. Now, here's the thing that I tend to look at these guys as. I don't see them as founders necessarily. I use the word because most people understand that language. But personally, I don't think they were founding anything. They are discovering things. They took just like an architect wants to build a new structure. They took all the materials that they had available and they assembled something that worked for the time and place. And that's what they were. And so my background, I used to run Preservation South Carolina in historic preservation. After I did the marketing stuff, my wife and I divorced, and I ran Preservation South Carolina for 14 years. So I love historic preservation. And I can attribute the analogy of building a structure well and then having a maintenance manual on how to take care of that structure. And that's what I see Washington's farewell address as being, a maintenance manual that he gave to the citizenry and said, I am voluntarily leaving. He left after 2 terms. He could have stayed as long as he wanted and set that precedence. He left after 2 terms. And it was such a powerful precedence that we didn't have to put any constitutional amendment in place because of that tradition until Roosevelt broke the tradition, and then the Congress had to put it in. But he set that manual that laid out all of these things that we need to think about in order to keep our republic. Just like Franklin told the lady out of the Constitutional Convention, it's a republic if you can keep it. Well, Washington's farewell address was that manual on how to keep it. So I studied that for years. I took out some of the points, and I created 40 policy points that are 40 of these theses in this book. And that's how it came about. I've been working on it for about 10 years on thought, really put pen to paper in the past 2 years. And it was released in the fall of last year, and the audio book has just been released in the past 4 weeks.
Oh, nice. Congrats.
Thank you.
So it's a tie between Washington and Martin Luther. In Washington, some of his history, he's the richest man. He was a surveyor, but he was a great speechwriter. And his inaugural, you have his farewell address. His inaugural address is one of the most important American speeches as well.
Absolutely.
You agree with that? Yeah.
Yes. Yep. And he the thing about Washington, and there was a lot of hubris involved in this. I mean, every man has his quirks and foibles, right? They bring what their life is, and so Washington knew he wanted to be head of the army. He knew he could do it. So when he showed up at the Constitutional Convention, he showed up in his uniform thinking they're going to give it to him. So he had a high sense of himself, but he also understood there was responsibility with that. And he knew everything he did will set the precedent for whatever happened afterwards. So he was very conscious of that. And it's an admirable trait of a great leader.
Right. A great leader all the way through, and really kept the whole thing together. Can you do me a favor, Mike, and just turn off your cam? There's just a tiny little bit of lag. I think it'll sound better coming through. So you start off with the preamble in the book and your theses. You have the 95 theses. Can you talk about why what the general introductory theses are and why they're relevant today?
Well, so there's 95 theses. So I did it in the same way. I constructed this in the same way Martin Luther constructed his, which is really an academic methodology for introducing an idea that people can debate. So it's a very academic exercise. And so what I did, I set up the first 20 or so theses are just setting the case that we are a republic. These people were architects. They created something that needs to be protected, and I just go through the thoughts that led to, now here's the points. And so each part, I have it broken up into 9 parts, and each part is segmented into different ideas that Washington broke down in his farewell address. One of those is about foreign entanglements and foreign policy. One of those is about the poisonous aspect of political party that is in place. The other one is fiscal responsibility. And then the fourth was mine that I put in. Washington didn't talk about the corporatization. I think what has occurred in our society that I think has really poisoned the system is the corporatization of our society and the ability of global and ultranational corporations having state power that comes in and compromises people on the ground's ability to govern themselves through the electoral process and have control over their communities and their environment where they live. These corporations have almost turned into state entities in a way, and that's
Right.
one thing our founders could not have anticipated to the degree that it turned into.
Right.
Yeah, they just didn't anticipate the power of that. Washington understood the power of party,
Right.
but that's kind of tied in. What happened to party is what's happened to corporations and the wealth that they've been able to build and compromise the ability of individuals in many of our places to build their own wealth unless you buy into the corporate system. And that's
Right.
what's happened on an economic level. That's what's happened on a political level with the parties.
Right. Because the parties are taking all this money to self-sustain, so it's like a cartel. The
Well, it
corporations
is.
and
Yep, it is. So here's the example. One of the things I did when I started writing the book, I said I have to put um my life in the front line of this. So I decided to run for Congress as an independent. Now I am in the 3rd district of South Carolina, and Representative Duncan was here then, and this is probably the most red district in the whole country. And so this is where Lindsey Graham came from and what he came out of here in this district. And
gotcha.
so Jeff Duncan had a problem with being caught having an affair last fall. And the Republican machinery here in the state that was really a creation of not only of Strom Thurmond, but also Lee Atwater. Lee Atwater helped build the Republican Party machine in the state, the modern one that's being used now. And they pretty much made clear to Jeff he's not running again. So they started looking for somebody. And what happened was we had a pretty big field of 5 Republicans running. We had 2 or 3 Democrats, but Democrats never get more than 25% in this district. And I went as an independent, and I had been working with a party called the Alliance Party, which was started by 2 good friends of mine, a Democrat and a Republican. Primarily, both of them had run for governor, and primarily as a way to say we need to work together and outside the machinery that both the Democratic that Clyburn has created. Clyburn has created a horrendous Democratic machine here where everybody has to toe the line. And Lee Atwater did the same thing with the Republican Party, also as follow-up from Strom Thurmond's time. So I went the middle way with this party, and I knew it'd be hard to do. And I'm always open for miracles to happen, right? You never know. But what ended up happening was the lady that ended up becoming the front runner after a primary runoff, I was told when I started running that you're going to need $250,000 to run, which I think is a sin that you have to do that. She ended up raising $950,000.
Wow.
Sherry Biggs. And what was even more horrific about that, in my mind, was not only that she raised that money, but in the last 3 months of her candidacy, when it was obvious in any polling she was way ahead, that's when outside money started pouring in. And so all the Republican senators and congressmen in Washington fed her money, because if you have a committee to raise funds for yourself, the law allows you to take that money and give it to another candidate. So she got almost $290,000 came to her when she was already locked in. And so that is what I was running against. And because of the marketing that was done over the past decades, we have South Carolina is one of only 7 states, and it was 7 last year. I don't know if it's changed, where you don't have to vote the names. You can hit just R or D.
Oh, gotcha.
And so party. That's right. Just hit R for Republican. And the Republican Party here has done a great job of branding themselves with symbolism of symbol of what they're voting for, but then being part of the machinery that is here. Now, I want to say I grew up in a Republican household. My first president I voted for was Reagan. But my disenchantment with the Republican Party came as I started realizing the foreign policy initiatives of Reagan and the intrusion in other countries and the foreign entanglements that the Goldwater Reagan neocon Republican Party was doing, which I saw as a huge problem. And so, because I think it compromises our sovereignty, ourselves, to tie ourselves into these other nations' conflicts. And so I have a lot of talking in my book about Washington's farewell address, talking about how neutrality is so important. And I want to reemphasize, neutrality is not isolationism. It's just a policy of how you engage. We can be engaged with countries all over the world, but it doesn't mean we always pick sides. But we build relationships on the reality on the ground. Every country has their own culture, and you have to respect that. And there's a certain amount of faith in God's creation that we have here of all these nations, that you have to have faith in yourself that whatever's going on in another country, positive engagement with that is better than negative. And it tends to create more problems when we go the negative. And we could get in that with all the different wars the past 30 years.
Oh, it's still happening right now. I wish Lindsey Graham would have understood that he was once in that same 3rd congressional district that you ran for, right?
Yep.
And that congressional district, for people in your mind's eye, that's far western South Carolina.
Yes. Yeah. Well, Northwest. Yeah. It's one of the largest ones. It's all very rural. And it's all the way from the mountains, all the way down, halfway down the state, and 3 counties in. And it's a big one. And so, yeah.
So that's it. So like this whole foreign entanglements, that was a huge issue for the beginning of this country, because there were foreign entanglements that even Washington was involved in, the French-Indian War. So they were and the English, obviously, were in the Revolution. So this was an issue from the very beginning of this country, right?
From that very beginning. And the thing is, the folks over here, everybody's got to remember, when they think of America and the founding, they tend to think of this world power that just happened to pop out of the colonial experience. We were a small little strip of people that, one thing, barely got along, because we were from all over Europe. And at the time, sectarian violence was really real. Where I live, my Bedenbaugh ancestors were German, and some of them were loyalists because they saw no reason to rebel against a Hanoverian German king that gave them their land, whereas their neighbors were Scotch-Irish, and we know the relationship of the Scotch-Irish with the British Redcoats. So the revolution in South Carolina was one by the guerrilla warfare of the Scotch Irish. They were the ones that won the war. But after the war, there was a road between where the settlement of my ancestors and the Scotch Irish lived, and it was called the Dead Road. And if anybody passed, they wouldn't survive it up until 1820, 1830.
Wow.
So what's fascinating is how the Constitution, and when these men got together in Philadelphia, they constructed something that focused on the higher sense of how we can govern in a way that everybody can fulfill their own sense of aspiration within their own cultural outlook and their religious outlook. That's the only way this thing could happen. And that's the other bigger picture I'm saying now is I think this experiment can still work, but we have to recognize the federal character of our nation, and it's the only way this nation can exist. And everything happening out of Washington is a suicidal pact for us.
And can you elaborate on that? Why is it a suicidal pact?
Because when everything, the genius of our country of our nation is federalism. You know, South Carolina is not the same cultural state as California, as Massachusetts, any of these other states. And there's a certain element, well, the 10th Amendment, right? The 10th Amendment says, whatever we have not articulated here, the states take care of all that. That belongs to the states. So there is a sense of an element of sovereignty on local things that the states could do that would help offset. You know, the way I look at it is a clock. I'm into antiques. So imagine a giant pendulum of a giant clock on a thin table and how unstable it is. But imagine a bigger table with 50 little clocks with little pendulums, right? And it's just more stable that way. And that's the analogy that I have for our nation. We would be more stable if we diffuse the power more into the states as we originally were up until the until World War One, when the drift as we became a world power started taking over our psyche of who we were and who we needed to be.
Right, and it corresponds with fiscal irresponsibility too, right?
Well, and here's the fiscal thing that's happened, because one of the things I talk about in the book is the states have become colonies of the federal government, because what's happened, because everything now is, the race to the bottom of having lower taxes is more effective on statewide. So when you have a state saying we're not going to raise taxes, and you have then a income tax directly from the federal government, taking money directly out of people's pocket going to the federal government, it allowed the politicians of the states to go, oh, well, federal government's making all this money. We can get money from them to help us, and we can lower our taxes in states. So governors and state legislatures say, we're going to lower your taxes. So everybody, oh, wow, that's great. Lower your taxes. And then the federal government is able to take more because it's so readily easy just to take it right out of your pocketbook. And so what we have is we have a system where South Carolinians are spending so much more money to the feds, and then that money is being sold to come back. And we're electing people who campaign on, I'll bring the money back, instead of, and they become salesmen for bringing money back to their communities. And
instead of keeping it, right?
That's right. It's a broken system. So one of my things is that we need to have a long-term plan to shift the burden of taxation to be more on the states and less on the feds. I'm all for the breakup of the financial aspect to the federal government of what Doge and them tried to do. I think it was done badly and irresponsibly because it's done too emotionally. And if things are coming down in the feds, then you need to be able to have the states and a relationship to have a plan to work that. A perfect example is our roads. So, and our schools. So I'm here in a little county, Newberry County, and our roads here are horrendous. They're horrendous. I mean, and I'm history of town and prosperity. And I know the prosperity in 1900, they bought the roads, they paved the roads, and they took care of the roads in the town. Well, no town takes care of their roads anymore. All that stuff gets jobbed out to the next government up and next government up. And now the federal government is subsidizing our state highway department by almost 50%.
Wow, that's
So
huge.
we can't even take care of our own roads. We can't take care of our own mental health issues. Mental health was always a state issue. And South Carolina had one of the first asylums designed by Robert Mintz, the man who designed the Washington Monument, was a great architect here in the state. He built one of the first modern asylums in 1820. Groundbreaking. We had a groundbreaking mental health system, but and it grew and it was very effective. It had its problems as anything, like, you know, the abuses that had happened, but overall it was a groundbreaking system that, instead of fixing, what happened was they became dependent on the federal government to subsidize building new buildings, and they were able to lower their responsibility, and the federal government were able to raise. And then when Reagan came in and did all these cuts to that sort of thing, say, listen, that's a state issue. The state should, federal government's not subsidizing that anymore. But the state never picked up the responsibility. And now in Colombia, we have no state asylum. The system is destroyed. And you go into Colombia and you have schizophrenic homeless walking the streets under blankets
Right.
instead of a system to take care of them. And so part of my book is talking about we have to take on the responsibility of local control and figure that out on how to do that.
Right, but don't you think the money's closer to the people who are spending it would
Yes.
ensure that it's spent wisely? Like, I mean, it just makes perfect sense.
There's always an element of corruption that people have to be vigilant. We've Another problem we have, and this is going to be a lot of educational things we have to deal with, is that we've our citizenry assumes so much of our nation being perpetual and it's always here and it's not vulnerable to anything. And so they don't have a sense of responsibility to make sure it's running efficiently and running properly. And so, you know, there's still an element of corruption that can happen. We have a terrible corruption going on in our state house now without going into it. A good friend of mine is on the state legislature and they're trying to fix some of this stuff. But it takes a vigilant citizenry to make sure that happens. But in the long run, it is easier for people locally to be in control of that and to watch it than just having it as a line item in a big federal budget that looks great on, you know, the NBC News. I'll give you a perfect example. Near here, when Biden did this Build Back Better, right, which is nothing but just throwing money at the states to spend money. Look for something to spend money on. So near here, there's a little town called Silver Street. And Silver Street is really not much of a town anymore. They still have a little post office, but most of the stores are gone. But it did have a railroad crossing. And years ago, because Strom Thurmond got a grant, they built a bridge. It was just a 2-lane road over it. Well, they built this big bridge over the railroad track so the railroad wouldn't have to deal with the crossing. Well, the bridge, that was in the 60s, and the bridge was really bad. So 2 years ago, Build Back Better said, we'll build a new bridge. So this same bridge that was there, they tore it down and built. Well, that sounds fine. Problem is that railroad has been empty and not used for 20 years. So they built this big, expensive bridge over a strip of rails, rotten cross ties, and Foxville, which is a weed. And locally, if that was controlled more locally, that wouldn't have happened. And so that's the type of stuff we need to seriously consider, taking responsibility of our own thing. Our school district should be funded by the state and not by federal government subsidizing it. Our kids have gotten dumber, and it's all about data driven. My wife's a teacher. My mother was a teacher, my grandmother and my great grandmother. I was for a while in a private school. I fully understand what it takes to get kids to learn. And it has very little to do with what's on a test data sheet you got to send to Department of Education.
Right. That's the reason for the data, so that the Department of Education can analyze it and show what a great job they're doing, right?
That's right. And the administrative technocracy that is created around that data creation that is subsidized by the money coming in, they're rewarded by being able to make speeches about look how much money we got in. And it's really an addictive sickness that we have. One of the most frustrating things I had when I was running, I go and meet with mayors, and the first thing almost every mayor asked me was, "So what money are you going to bring back to us?"
Wow.
Yeah,
Interesting.
yeah.
It's
So
amazing. Yeah.
it is. It's a deep set issue that's happening. That's going to take a lot of focus and time, and I'm willing to take the time to push it, man.
But frankly, we can't afford it. I mean, here's the thing: we're about to go bankrupt. They're putting out these huge bills, and you have all these. I mean, the educational system throughout the entire United States, college and public schools, are riddled with bureaucrats. I mean,
Yeah.
who have huge salaries. I think the person who runs the Department of Education was making $600,000 a year plus all the benefits. I mean, crazy amounts. They
It's
say
crazy.
that
And
it's 2 to 1. Like there's 2 students to 1 administrator. It's off the charts.
it's crazy. And in our little school, now I grew up in schools where my principal in elementary school was Grady Lee Halfacre. He was my mom's science teacher when she was in school. He was someone, the Halfacres were a family here that came here the same time the Bedenbaughs came here in the 1700s. Here was Grady Lee was my principal that knew everybody. And then my second cousin, Bedenbaugh, was the superintendent. You know, we had an indigenous population of educators that grew up in the ranks, were educated, and knew the children. They sat in the church pews by the parents. It was a community. That doesn't exist anymore in our school system. Now it's about if you have a PhD, if you have this, that's all you need. And so, you know, there's principals that really don't understand how to be a principal, but they've got the qualifications and the PhD and the data on their sheets that say, oh, well, they're qualified, they should do it, and they get the job. So that type of stuff we have to have a major overhaul on. And so that's why my 40 points that I talk about from electoral reform on all of these different things, one thing won't fix it all. We need to have 10 or 20 things happening within the same time to shift everything into a way that makes it more accountable.
Gotcha. So more accountability, fiscal responsibility. These are
Yep.
kind of like the general, and also neutrality, foreign neutrality. Like we're
Foreign
addicted to.
neutrality.
Yeah, that's crazy.
Yep. So let me just go through some of the points that, so it's some
Okay, great.
specifics. Term limits, have to have term limits. Funding for candidates. Now, I understand the problem with Citizens United. However, I am a strict constitutional conservative and a textualist. And as people have turned the Supreme Court into a legislative branch thinking it's up to their choice. Being a true conservative constitutionalist means you read the text and you read what it says. And judges are supposed to look at that text and say, here's what it says, here's the law, and this is how it should be interpreted. And it's up to the legislature to change or to amend the Constitution. So, what has happened over the past 150 years is that personhood has been attributed to corporations for trusts and stuff. So corporations would be protected by um, personhood, legal personhood. It's the way you can have a trust and transfer ownership from trust to families. But the Constitution and the law has not caught up to actual natural person and an artificial persona. And so one of my things is to amend the 14th Amendment to make sure we differentiate natural persons who are citizens, which is what the Constitution was written for, and artificial personas, which are corporations. You do that, it will fix all of that. Okay, that will detach corporate from the personhood of individual rights. I think they'll go a long way to do that. And then you also make it then to where if you're elected and if you're in a district, the only people that can actually give you money are people that can vote for you.
Right.
Right?
Yeah, it just
That's
makes
it.
perfect sense. Yeah.
That's it. But the way the law is crafted over the past 150 years, you can't do that now because of the natural person. So that has to be fixed before you can really do that. The issue of term limits, everybody says you need a constitutional amendment, and even though I know that would definitely fix it, I think the House of Representatives can make their own law rules on who are the members they seat.
Right.
And I think that's worth a try. I think people need to stop putting up shields of why they can't do something and start pushing the edge and getting it challenged so the conversation can start. But we have to do term limits. I'm not necessarily sure if I want to restrict how much money, because I don't know if that would be a problem, because that can be very arbitrary. But as long as every penny that you get, even if it's only people that vote for you, it's public. Any money you get is public. And now with the internet, you can put all this information up. And people need to know who's funding you and have that known.
Yeah.
Some of the other things is, and this is one of the big imbalances of our constitutional structure. We were a bicameral legislature. And Jefferson at first didn't like that. When he came back from France, he sat down with Washington and said, why do we have two? We only need representatives. And Washington made this phrase to him that, the House is directly from the people, and that can be short-term emotional. So what it is, the Senate represents the states who are members of the federal government. They're the ones that form the federal government. They represent the states. So the hot coffee is from the House that goes in the cool, solid cool, and to be thoughtful about, and that helps balance that out. And I think that's important. But what we did with the 17th Amendment is we destroyed that, made the Senate electable directly by the people. So we really have a unicameral legislature through the party system. To be one party, if they control both, you pretty much get whatever you want. And we need to have that conflict built back in there. That's going to be a hard thing to do, and that could be a generational change. I'm not under any idea that that's an easy thing to do, but we need to at least start the discussion. I think that's important. I think the governor needs to appoint with the state legislature can approve it, just like the president does Supreme Court. The state should do that and send people up that represent the state with 1 6-year term. So they're free to do what their own conscience tells them, but they're not there for a career.
Yeah. I mean, they never envisioned that people would be in these offices for 4 decades. It's crazy.
Well, the House of Representatives at the time, we had 3 million something people in the country when the Constitution was ratified. And so the House districts were just a little over 30,000 people.
Yeah, nothing.
Now it's 750,000. And it's fixed at the number of people. So it will always grow. And one of my big things is we have to bring that back down and tie it to numbers and not by the numbers of people. And that's going to take some discussion too. Again, this book is not me saying, here's the only way to do it. This book is the beginning of a conversation to say, here's what we need to discuss. Can we have an effective legislature that has 2,000 people in it? I think systems can be put in place that we can.
Yeah, I think you're right.
I think it's something that is noble to try to figure it out.
We have the technology.
We have especially now. We got the technology. It's perfect. And so with the technology to make the district smaller, make the people more accountable to them, only the people there in the district. I mean, imagine if we just reduce it down to 100,000 people, which is still a lot. But I think that's doable with 100,000 people. And only out of those people can you give money it will make such a more efficient House. Now they'd have to create different rules and more systems to where bills can be debated and stuff in larger committees. That sort of stuff can be worked through. But what it will do is shift a lot of power to the Senate. But the House will still be able to counter the Senate. So I think it's something worth doing. But I know the system has been so politicized, and I think the way it is now is what's led to such a politicization of the Supreme Court picks, because of the impassioned emotions that are happening around the elected senators choosing the Supreme Court.
Right. There's a lot of things that need to change and be reformed. There's no question about it. Mike, we are at the 45-minute mark. Where can people find your book, and where can people find you?
Well, I can be found. The book is Reviving Our Republic. I have a webpage, revivingourrepublic.com. I have a podcast called Reviving the Republic with Mike Bedenbaugh, where I have a lot of old interviews where I talk about all this stuff, but content there. And I'm on Amazon, Reviving Our Republic. And I appreciate everybody giving it a chance, looking at it. And if they do decide, please give me a review. I've got some incredible reviews on it. I look forward to taking this nationally to where we can have a new conversation where people can have individual sovereignty within a liberty, and we could be the type of nation we're always meant to be again.
Yeah. Amen. And again, they can contact you at your website, Reviving Our Republic, correct?
Yes. Yep. They can contact me there.
Yeah. So people can see that, but you can see the ebook, paperback, and audiobook. So you can see that, all the 5-star reviews, etc. And again, the full title of the book is Reviving Our Republic, 95 Theses for the Future of America, a Citizen's Call for Restoring Our Nation's Principles. And the author, again, is Mike Bedenbaugh, Bedenbaugh. Thank you so much for your time.
GH. William, thank you very much. Take care.
All right, cheers. Stay there. I'll just shut